David, Sarah, and Emily seemed like the perfect family, but one shocking night would destroy everything, revealing a secret no mother should ever witness. In the quiet suburb where Sarah lived with her husband David and their daughter Emily, nothing ever seemed unusual from the outside. The neighbors saw them as a picture-perfect family. Their house stood with a freshly painted fence, trimmed hedges, and a porch light that glowed warmly at night. Every Sunday morning, they walked together to church, smiling and greeting everyone with polite kindness. David, with his calm demeanor, was admired as a hard-working man who provided well for his family. Sarah, always graceful and organized, kept the house spotless and raised Emily with the care of a devoted mother. Emily herself was considered a bright teenager, polite to adults, and often seen walking the family dog after school. To the world, they seemed untouchable, the type of family others secretly envied. But perfection was only skin deep. Behind closed doors, silence often hung in the air like a heavy curtain. Sarah had begun to feel it long before anyone else noticed. At dinner, David would barely speak, and Emily would stare at her plate, lost in her own thoughts. What once was a lively household filled with laughter had turned into a place of quiet tension. Sarah convinced herself it was just teenage mood swings or the stress of David's work, yet something about their interactions didn't feel right. There were small, almost invisible signals: David's lingering glances at Emily, sudden changes in her behavior, and a subtle distance that grew between mother and daughter. Sarah ignored these warnings, convincing herself she was only imagining things. But beneath the neat facade of the family home, cracks were forming. The house that looked perfect from the street was in fact hiding a secret so dark that it would eventually shatter their lives forever. Sarah's unease grew stronger with every passing day, though she could not explain it clearly to herself. She had always trusted her instincts, and now those instincts told her that something inside her home was wrong. David no longer showed the same affection he once did. He avoided her touch, made excuses to stay late at work, and when he was home, he would lock himself in the study for hours. Emily, too, seemed to have changed. The cheerful girl who once shared everything with her mother had become secretive, shutting her bedroom door and guarding her phone like a prized possession. Sarah tried to dismiss her worries, blaming the changes on adolescence and the stress of family responsibilities, yet the thought refused to leave her mind. Her suspicion sharpened when she noticed how quickly the atmosphere shifted whenever she entered a room. Conversations would stop. Both David and Emily would glance at her with nervous expressions before pretending everything was normal. Sarah began noticing other strange details, like hushed whispers from the other side of walls, footsteps moving quietly at night, and the feeling of eyes following her in her own home. These moments felt fleeting, but they left her heart pounding, as if she had stepped into a place where she no longer belonged. One evening, she caught a brief glimpse of something that unsettled her even more. David and Emily were sitting unusually close on the couch, their shoulders brushing, and when they noticed Sarah in the doorway, they immediately jumped apart. The image burned itself into Sarah's mind. Though she had no proof, the seed of dread had been planted. Her once safe home now felt like a stage where something sinister was being carefully hidden from her sight. It was a quiet evening when Sarah's world changed forever. She had gone to visit a friend nearby, but returned earlier than expected, stepping into her house just past midnight. The silence inside felt strange, heavier than usual. She moved carefully through the hallway, noticing that David's study was empty and the living room lights had been switched off. For a moment, she assumed both her husband and daughter were asleep, but when she reached the bedroom door, something stopped her in her tracks. A faint noise, almost like a muffled giggle, slipped through the crack of the door. Sarah's hand trembled as she pushed it open, her heart beating violently in her chest. What she saw made her freeze. There, in the dim glow of the bedside lamp, were David and Emily, tangled together in bed. For a second, her mind refused to process the scene. The image seared into her eyes, yet her body felt disconnected from reality. The betrayal was not only unbearable, it was unthinkable. Her husband, the man she had trusted for years, and her own daughter, the child she had raised and loved beyond measure, were locked in an intimacy that shattered every boundary of family, morality, and decency. Sarah's breath caught in her throat, but no sound escaped her lips. A scream lingered at the edge of her voice, yet she swallowed it, terrified of exposing that she had seen them. Instead, she stepped back into the hallway, retreating like a shadow. The walls of the house, once her sanctuary, now felt like a prison built on secrets too monstrous to bear. In that moment, Sarah knew nothing in her life would ever be the same again. Sarah drifted through the house that night in complete silence, her body moving but her mind numb. She had seen something no mother or wife should ever witness, and yet she carried it like a ghost in her chest. She did not confront David or Emily. She did not cry or rage. Instead, she swallowed her horror and forced herself to behave as if nothing had happened. To the outside eye, it looked like composure, but in reality, it was shock. Her silence was not weakness, it was survival. The next morning, Sarah cooked breakfast as usual. She placed plates on the table, poured coffee into David's mug, and greeted Emily with the same motherly tone she had used for years. Both of them acted as if everything were normal, and Sarah mirrored their performance. Inside, however, her thoughts twisted into knots. She replayed the image from the night before, every detail sharper than a knife. The betrayal felt unbearable, but she understood one thing clearly. If she reacted too soon, she would lose control. Days passed in the same strange calm. Sarah moved through her routines like an actress performing a role, pretending not to notice when David avoided her gaze or when Emily's behavior seemed unnatural. Her silence became her weapon, allowing her to observe without drawing suspicion. The household seemed balanced on fragile glass, and she was careful not to shatter it just yet. Behind her calm expression, her mind raced with possibilities, questions, and dark thoughts she had never allowed herself to imagine before. Her silence was not surrender. It was the first step towards something far more dangerous. In the quiet, she began to plan. Sarah's decision to remain quiet gave her time to think, but it also gave her the chance to act. She knew that if she ever wanted to confront what she had seen, she would need proof. Without evidence, it would be her word against theirs, and Emily was under David's control. So Sarah began to watch more closely, sharpening her instincts and paying attention to every small detail. She noticed the subtle signals others might overlook. The way David's hand lingered on Emily's shoulder, the way Emily seemed protective whenever Sarah asked where she had been, the sudden silences whenever she entered a room. These moments told her she was not imagining things, but suspicion alone was not enough. One morning, after sending Emily off to school, Sarah drove to a small electronics shop in another town. There, she bought several discreet cameras and tiny audio recorders. She hid them in her purse, careful not to leave any trace of her purchase. At home, she placed them carefully around the house, one in the living room shelf, another in David's study, a third tucked behind a bedroom lamp. Every placement was deliberate, positioned to catch what might unfold when she wasn't present. Alongside the cameras, Sarah began digging into David's personal life. She checked his laptop late at night, memorizing passwords, scanning through files, and reviewing deleted emails. On Emily's phone, she discovered locked folders that deepened her fears. Each new clue added weight to her growing collection of secrets. Sarah no longer felt powerless. Her pain was slowly transforming into determination. With every hidden recording and every stolen glimpse of evidence, she was building the truth brick by brick. She knew it was only a matter of time before everything came to light. Sarah's search for answers led her deeper into the shadows of her own home. One afternoon, while cleaning Emily's room, she noticed a small notebook tucked beneath the mattress. At first, she thought it was an ordinary diary filled with teenage worries and secrets. But when she opened it, her hands began to tremble. The pages were filled with writings that confirmed her worst fears. Emily had written about late nights spent with her father, describing emotions and moments that no daughter should ever experience. The words were raw, sometimes confused, but undeniably real. Each sentence was like a blade cutting into Sarah's heart. She sat on the edge of the bed, reading in disbelief. The journal revealed how David had manipulated Emily, convincing her to keep their relationship hidden, telling her lies that blurred the lines between love and control. Emily's voice in the writing sounded torn, at times expressing guilt but also confessing attachment. Sarah realized that her daughter was not just involved. She was trapped in a cycle of manipulation that twisted her sense of right and wrong. The discovery left Sarah shattered. It was no longer just suspicion supported by glances or hidden recordings. Now she had written proof, something undeniable. Yet, instead of rushing to the police, Sarah closed the notebook and carefully put it back exactly where she had found it. She knew Emily might notice if it was missing, and she could not risk losing her advantage. That night, Sarah lay awake with the words echoing in her mind. The betrayal was deeper than she had imagined, and the evidence was stronger than she ever wanted. She understood now that silence would not save her family. Something had to be done, and the path ahead would be darker than anything she had faced before. The weight of what Sarah had uncovered pressed on her like a suffocating blanket. Every time she looked at Emily, she felt both anger and sorrow, torn between the image of her innocent child and the reality described in that diary. Each glance at David filled her with disgust. He carried on as if nothing was wrong, as if their family were still whole, yet Sarah knew he had destroyed everything. The more she thought about it, the clearer it became that she could not live in silence forever. Something inside her had snapped, and there was no way to repair it. For days, she debated with herself. Should she go to the police? Should she expose them immediately? But each scenario played out in her mind with consequences she feared. If Emily defended David, the authorities might not believe Sarah. If the story became public, Emily would carry the shame for life, and Sarah would lose her daughter entirely. The risks seemed unbearable, yet doing nothing felt worse, like allowing a poison to spread unchecked. Her thoughts grew darker. She began to imagine ways to remove David from their lives permanently. At first, these were fleeting, angry fantasies, visions of accidents, sudden illnesses, or confrontations that ended violently. But soon the fantasies hardened into possibilities. She caught herself researching late at night, her laptop filled with searches about undetectable poisons, household chemicals, and how investigations worked. The quiet, grieving woman she had been was changing into someone unrecognizable. Sarah realized she was crossing a line in her own mind. She was no longer just a victim of betrayal. She was preparing to become something else entirely. Her rage was guiding her, and she knew a decision was coming that would seal all of their fates. Sarah's anger no longer burned quietly inside her. It had taken shape, turning into a dangerous plan. She told herself over and over that what David had done was unforgivable, that no justice system could ever truly punish him for corrupting their daughter. The thought of going to the authorities seemed weak compared to the satisfaction of watching him pay directly. Her mind convinced her that this was not just revenge. It was a form of protection, a way to save Emily from his grip, even if Emily herself could not yet see it. She began sketching out ideas in her head, like a strategist preparing for battle. Violence with her own hands felt too obvious, too risky. She needed something subtle, something that looked like fate had intervened. Illness seemed perfect, a quiet killer that would raise little suspicion. Sarah researched in secret, carefully deleting her browsing history each night. She discovered stories of people who had used poisons that mimicked natural causes. Antifreeze appeared again and again in her searches, described as a deadly liquid with a sweet taste, capable of slipping unnoticed into food or drink. Her imagination began to spiral. She pictured David growing weaker each day, doctors confused, friends pitying him, no one suspecting the truth. She imagined Emily finally freed from his control, grieving perhaps, but eventually safe. These visions gave Sarah a sense of calm she had not felt in weeks. Her plan was becoming more than an idea. It was becoming a mission. The thought terrified her, but it also gave her strength. She was moving from a silent observer of horror to the architect of her husband's downfall. For the first time in a long while, Sarah felt like she had power in her hands. Sarah's plan solidified the moment she walked into a small automotive store on the edge of town. The shelves smelled faintly of oil and rubber, an ordinary place where no one would ever suspect something sinister. She bought a bottle of antifreeze, its bright green liquid sealed in a clear container. To the cashier, she was just another customer preparing for the winter season. To Sarah, it was the weapon she had chosen to change everything. She carried it home in a shopping bag, her heart pounding with both fear and determination. At the house, she hid the container in a corner of the garage behind old paint cans. She made sure Emily wouldn't stumble upon it, and David never spent much time there anyway. Each time she walked past it, she felt a strange mixture of dread and empowerment. The answer to her torment was hidden in plain sight, waiting for her to use it. Sarah practiced patience. She knew she could not act too quickly or too carelessly. Instead, she studied the chemical carefully, reading articles about how it worked in the body, how it could cause kidney failure and look like natural illness. The more she learned, the more certain she became that this was the perfect solution. Her mind rehearsed the steps over and over again. A small dose mixed into David's favorite drink, maybe wine or juice, would be enough to begin the process. It would not raise suspicion immediately. It would unfold like a sickness no one could explain. Every detail of her plan was shaped to appear natural, invisible. As the days passed, the weight of the secret grew heavier, but so did Sarah's resolve. She had chosen her weapon, and soon she would put it to use. Sarah waited for the right evening. The house hummed with its usual quiet. She prepared David's favorite glass of red wine, hands steady though her heart raced. A small measure of antifreeze slid from the hidden bottle into the wine. She mixed it until it looked untouched. She placed the glass on the side table where David liked to keep his drink while reading. She moved as if performing a domestic task, folding a blanket, straightening a cushion, careful that nothing betrayed her. David reached for the glass later, unaware. He drank and smiled at nothing, then walked to his study. Sarah watched him from the doorway. Minutes later, he complained of a headache and doubled over at the sink. Her face remained blank while panic and grim satisfaction warred inside. She offered water, then watched him stumble to the chair, skin pale and hands trembling. The symptoms were subtle at first: nausea, dizziness, a feverish flush. She called for a doctor, arranging an appointment that would appear routine. Doctors examined him, ran tests, and asked questions Sarah answered with practiced serenity. Blood work showed abnormalities but did not point clearly to poisoning. The official line suggested food poisoning or a viral infection. Friends and neighbors sent messages of concern. Sarah sat by his bedside, exhausted and watchful. Each cough and shiver he suffered felt like confirmation that her plan worked, yet a part of her recoiled at the evidence of his pain. She watched every sign, measuring doses in her mind and waiting to see how far the illness would progress before suspicion might grow. In the quiet of that room, a terrible new reality began to take shape closely. The days that followed tested Sarah's patience and resolve. The first dose had weakened David, but it wasn't enough. He grew pale, his appetite diminished, and he spent most of his time resting in bed. He complained of constant fatigue and an unshakable ache in his stomach. Doctors ordered more tests, but still nothing conclusive appeared. Each report came back uncertain, describing symptoms that could belong to dozens of ordinary illnesses. To everyone else, it looked like a mystery infection. To Sarah, it was progress, though painfully slow. She began slipping larger amounts of antifreeze into his drinks. Sometimes she mixed it with juice at breakfast, sometimes into the glass of wine he insisted on having at dinner. David trusted her, never suspecting that the very woman who tucked blankets around him at night was the one orchestrating his decline. Sarah moved carefully, never allowing Emily to witness the moments she poured. Soon David could no longer manage daily routines. He struggled to walk without support and often clutched his side in pain. He missed work, called in sick, and began canceling meetings. His colleagues expressed concern, while Emily dedicated herself to caring for him, sitting by his side and helping with small tasks. Watching her daughter nurse the man who had betrayed them both was almost unbearable for Sarah, but she forced herself to remain composed. With every groan and every drop of sweat rolling down David's forehead, Sarah felt the balance of power shifting. The man who had once held control over her family was crumbling under her hidden hand. She told herself it was justice disguised as illness, that the slow unraveling of his body was the only fitting punishment for the secret he had forced into their lives. The rain that evening fell in steady sheets, tapping against the windows like an impatient reminder. Sarah stood in the kitchen, staring at the half-empty bottle of antifreeze she had hidden for weeks. The plan had dragged on long enough. David's body was already weak, his skin gray, his movements sluggish, but he still clung to life. She told herself this would be the last time, the final step to free herself and Emily from his hold. She poured the wine with careful hands, her reflection staring back from the dark liquid. This time, she added far more than before. The sweet, poisonous fluid blended seamlessly, invisible to the eye. When she carried the glass to David, she wore the mask of a concerned wife, hovering over him with quiet devotion. He accepted it without hesitation, his trust in her still unbroken despite the sickness consuming him. Hours later, the change was undeniable. David writhed in the bed, his breath shallow, sweat soaking the sheets. His body shook violently, convulsions twisting his limbs as though something inside was tearing him apart. Sarah stood close, her expression unreadable, while Emily rushed about the room in panic, begging to call an ambulance. Sarah allowed her to dial, but by the time help arrived, David was already gone. Doctors could only pronounce him dead, attributing it at first glance to sudden organ failure brought on by a mysterious illness. Neighbors whispered about the tragedy, speaking of a hard-working man taken too soon. Sarah sat still among them, silent and hollow. Yet inside she felt both relief and dread. The man who had shattered her family was finally gone, but his absence carried a weight that was heavier than she had ever imagined. The house felt emptier than ever after David's death. The sound of his coughs, his groans, and the shuffle of his weak steps were gone, replaced by an eerie silence that seemed to stretch into every corner. Emily wept constantly, her face swollen from tears, clinging to Sarah as if she were her last anchor. She refused to leave the bedroom where David had spent his final days, curling against his pillow as though she could still feel his presence there. To her, it was not only the loss of a father, but the end of a secret bond she had believed was love. Sarah watched her daughter's grief with a strange mix of emotions. On one hand, she wanted to comfort her, to hold Emily close and remind her she was still loved. On the other, each sob felt like a knife, reminding her of the twisted relationship she had uncovered and destroyed. Sarah had expected relief, a sense of freedom after David's death, but instead she felt haunted by the image of Emily's pain. The girl she had tried to protect was mourning the very man who had ruined her. Friends and neighbors dropped by with condolences, offering food, prayers, and sympathetic words. To them, Sarah was the grieving widow, strong for her daughter in a time of tragedy. They saw a woman carrying on with dignity, while inside Sarah felt like a fraud. She nodded politely, accepted casseroles and flowers, and said thank you, all the while hiding the truth that David's death was no accident. At night, when Emily cried herself to sleep, Sarah lay awake, staring at the ceiling. She had taken her revenge, but instead of peace, a hollow ache had taken its place, whispering that the story was far from over. Emily's sorrow soon began to shift into suspicion. At first, she had been too consumed by grief to notice anything unusual, but as the days passed, small details began gnawing at her. She remembered how calm her mother had been during David's final hours, how Sarah never panicked even when his body convulsed violently. She thought about the drinks Sarah had always brought him, how no one else ever touched his glass. These fragments of memory stitched themselves together into a troubling picture Emily could not ignore. Late at night, she replayed the moments in her mind, asking herself whether her mother had known more than she had shown. The thought seemed impossible. Sarah had always been the caring mother, the steady hand holding their home together. But the more Emily examined the timeline, the more she wondered if her mother's silence had hidden something darker. One evening, while searching for comfort among David's belongings, Emily stumbled upon an empty wine bottle at the back of the cabinet. Its rim held a faint, strange smell she couldn't identify, but it stirred a deep unease. She remembered clearly that her father had drunk wine every night before his condition worsened, always served by Sarah. That memory deepened her doubts. Emily didn't confront her mother right away. Instead, she began to watch Sarah as carefully as Sarah had once watched her. She noted the way her mother avoided eye contact, the way she stayed unusually composed whenever neighbors spoke of David's sudden illness. The seed of suspicion grew stronger with each passing day, twisting Emily's grief into mistrust. Love for her mother and loyalty to her father clashed inside her, leaving her caught between mourning and a terrible realization she wasn't ready to face. The official cause of David's death did not rest quietly for long. Although the doctors had initially attributed it to sudden organ failure, routine procedure required further testing. The autopsy revealed something alarming: traces of ethylene glycol in his bloodstream, the telltale chemical found in antifreeze. What at first looked like a natural illness now pointed to deliberate poisoning. The authorities quickly reclassified the case from medical tragedy to homicide, and investigators began combing through the family's life. Detectives visited the house within days. They asked questions about David's final weeks, his symptoms, his habits, and the food and drinks he consumed. Sarah answered carefully, her voice steady, sticking to the story of a mysterious illness. She made sure to appear helpful, even offering his medical records and explaining his recent health problems. Emily sat nearby, nervous and restless, but she provided her own recollections when pressed. She spoke about how her father had seemed perfectly healthy until suddenly collapsing into sickness, but her lingering glances at Sarah did not go unnoticed. Neighbors were also interviewed. They described Sarah as a devoted wife, always by David's side during his illness, but some mentioned how oddly composed she had seemed after his passing. What was once praised as strength now became a detail folded into suspicion. The investigators ordered a search of the house, moving through rooms with deliberate care. They collected bottles, food containers, and even glasses from the kitchen cabinets. Sarah tried to mask her fear, but her pulse quickened with every item bagged as evidence. She knew the walls of secrecy she had built were beginning to close in. The truth was no longer buried. It was being unearthed, piece by piece, by the cold hands of law. When the investigators returned to the house for a deeper search, Sarah felt the walls closing in. She had thought she had been careful, wiping counters, disposing of bottles, and hiding the antifreeze container. But in her obsession with poisoning David, she had overlooked something crucial. The small cameras she had planted weeks earlier, meant to catch evidence of his relationship with Emily, were still hidden around the house. She had used them sparingly, transferring some recordings onto memory cards, but in her haste, she had forgotten to destroy them. The detectives found the devices tucked neatly behind lamps and in corners of rooms. Curious about what they might reveal, they retrieved the memory cards and sent them for review. Sarah tried to mask her panic, insisting they were part of a family security system, but her explanations sounded weak against the thoroughness of the search. When the footage was analyzed, it delivered more than anyone expected. There were clips that confirmed her initial suspicions, scenes that hinted at the disturbing relationship between David and Emily. But just as damning were the recordings of Sarah herself. In several moments, she was caught pouring liquids into David's drinks when no one else was around. The angle was clear enough to show her actions, and while no one could see exactly what she added, the pattern was impossible to ignore. For the investigators, the evidence created a devastating timeline. A husband's health declining after nightly drinks served by his wife. The combination of the autopsy results and the hidden footage painted a picture too dark to dismiss. Sarah realized then that her own secret tools had betrayed her. What she thought would prove her right had instead become the very weapon that condemned her. The morning of Sarah's arrest arrived without warning. She was in the kitchen preparing tea when the sound of heavy knocks echoed through the house. Blue and red lights flashed outside the windows, and within moments, uniformed officers filled the doorway. Emily stood frozen at the top of the stairs, eyes wide, as her mother was handcuffed and read her rights. The neighbors gathered quickly, whispering among themselves, shocked to see the woman they believed to be a grieving widow now escorted away as a murder suspect. Sarah kept her head down, her face pale but composed. She said nothing as she was led past the cameras and curious onlookers, though inside her heart pounded violently. She thought of how she had once moved silently in her own home, collecting evidence, planning revenge, believing she was the one in control. Now, every step toward the waiting police car reminded her that she had lost all power. At the station, detectives laid out the evidence. The autopsy results, the toxicology report, the suspicious wine glasses, and most damning of all, the hidden camera footage. Each piece built a picture of deliberate poisoning, a cold and calculated plan carried out over weeks. Sarah listened in silence, realizing no denial could erase what they had uncovered. Back in the neighborhood, the news spread like wildfire. The community that once admired the family now whispered about betrayal, forbidden relationships, and murder. Sarah's arrest turned their quiet street into a stage for scandal. To the outside world, the mask had finally fallen. The perfect wife had become a killer. Yet within Sarah's mind, another truth lingered, one that no court would ever fully understand. She had not only killed her husband, she had destroyed the secret that had destroyed her. Sarah's trial began months later in a packed courthouse, drawing crowds eager to witness the unraveling of the family's dark secrets. Reporters filled the benches, cameras flashing each time she entered in her prison uniform, her once polished appearance replaced with a hollow, tired face. Prosecutors painted her as a calculating murderer who had patiently poisoned her husband, presenting the toxicology reports and video evidence as irrefutable proof. They spoke of methodical planning, of a woman who pretended to care for her sick husband while secretly orchestrating his death. The defense took a different path. They argued Sarah was a broken woman pushed beyond her limits, a wife who discovered an unthinkable betrayal between her husband and her daughter. They claimed her mind had fractured under the weight of the secret she carried, and that her actions, though deadly, were born out of trauma rather than malice. To strengthen their case, they suggested Sarah suffered from a psychological breakdown, that she was not in full control of her decisions. Emily's role became the most complicated part of the proceedings. She was called to the stand, her testimony shrouded in hesitation. While she avoided speaking of the alleged relationship with David, her nervousness only fueled speculation among the public. Some believed Sarah's story entirely, others dismissed it as a fabrication to excuse murder. As the trial stretched on, the court became divided between sympathy and condemnation. The evidence left little room for doubt about Sarah's guilt, but the motives behind her actions clouded the verdict in moral ambiguity. Each session revealed more of the family's fractures, making it clear that this was not just a case of poisoning, but a chilling collapse of trust, loyalty, and human boundaries. The day of the verdict arrived heavy with tension. The courthouse was silent as the jury filed in, their faces unreadable after days of deliberation. Sarah sat stiffly at the defense table, her eyes fixed on the floor, hands trembling despite her efforts to remain composed. Emily sat at the back of the courtroom, her face pale, knowing her testimony had left questions hanging in the air that no one dared address directly. The judge asked the jury for their decision, and the foreperson stood. The words rang out with finality, guilty of second-degree murder. A gasp rippled through the courtroom. Sarah closed her eyes, her body sagging as though the air had been pulled from her lungs. The sentence was read, life imprisonment with the possibility of parole after 25 years. Her lips pressed together, refusing to betray emotion, though inside she felt a strange mixture of despair and grim acceptance. The courtroom reacted with divided voices. Some whispered relief, convinced justice had been served for David's death. Others murmured pity, believing Sarah had been driven to desperation by the horror she discovered within her own home. The media outside seized on every detail, ready to broadcast headlines that framed her either as a cold-blooded killer or a tormented victim of unspeakable betrayal. As Sarah was led away in chains, she caught one last glimpse of Emily. Their eyes met briefly, an unspoken storm of blame, sorrow, and broken love flashing between them. It was a look that neither would forget, a reminder of the secret that had destroyed them both. In that moment, Sarah understood that her punishment was not just prison. It was living forever with the knowledge of what she had uncovered and what she had done. In the years that followed, Sarah's name never left the headlines. The story of the wife who poisoned her husband after uncovering a forbidden relationship with their daughter became a chilling tale that people whispered about in coffee shops, debated on television, and dissected in documentaries. Her trial transcripts were studied in universities, her case becoming a disturbing example of how secrets, when left to fester, could destroy not just one life, but an entire family. Inside prison, Sarah lived quietly, avoiding conflict and burying herself in routine. To others, she seemed hardened, but in her private hours she carried the weight of everything she had lost. Nights were the hardest, when silence pressed against her cell walls, leaving her alone with memories she wished she could erase. She replayed every discovery, every plan, every poisoned glass. The betrayal, the anger, and the pain twisted together until she could no longer separate them. Emily's life outside was equally fractured. She moved away, changed her name, and tried to bury her past, but the shadows followed her. Whispers lingered in every place she went, and though no charges had ever been brought against her, people's suspicions clung to her like smoke. The bond between mother and daughter had shattered forever, leaving only scars that time could not heal. The neighborhood where it all began never truly recovered either. The house where the family once lived stood empty, a silent monument to what had happened inside. Those who walked by crossed the street, glancing at it with unease. Sarah's story ended not with peace or forgiveness, but with a legacy of horror. It became a reminder that some secrets, once uncovered, could never be contained, and that truth itself could be the most dangerous weapon of all.